The sun had long set over the small village of Bale, casting long shadows across the narrow dirt paths. The night was supposed to bring peace, but in one particular home, the air was thick with tension. Inside the dimly lit hut, Kwame, a 10-year-old boy with sharp eyes and a heart too heavy for his age, sat in the corner, holding his little sister, Zuri, close to his chest. The thin walls of their home trembled under the weight of his parents' voices. "I work from dawn to dusk, and yet you stand there complaining," his father, Jabari, roared, his deep voice shaking the wooden shelves. "And what about me, Jabari? Do you think raising 2 children alone while you wander off to do as you please is easy?" his mother, Abeni, fired back, her voice sharp with pain. Kwame's small hands tightened around Zuri's tiny frame. She whimpered against his chest, her tiny fingers gripping his worn-out shirt. "Shhh, Zuri," he whispered, rocking her gently. "It will be over soon." But he knew that wasn't true. It was never over. His parents had been fighting for as long as he could remember. At first, it was just loud arguments, angry whispers in the night. But as time passed, the fights grew worse, shouting turned to pushing turned to things being thrown. And now, Kwame feared it would only get worse. The sound of a chair scraping violently against the floor made him flinch. He closed his eyes tightly, praying that his father wouldn't break anything tonight. "I do everything for this family, Abeni. But you're never satisfied," Jabari shouted. Abeni let out a bitter laugh. "You call this everything? You can barely keep food on the table, but you always have enough coins to waste at the marketplace." The argument continued, their words cutting through the silence of the night like sharp knives. Kwame felt his chest tighten. He wanted to scream, to beg them to stop. But he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Then, suddenly, there was silence. For a moment, Kwame dared to hope. Maybe they had finally exhausted themselves. Maybe, just maybe, this night wouldn't end in more broken furniture, more shattered trust. Then, slam! The door to the house burst open, and his father stormed out into the night, his heavy footsteps fading into the darkness. Kwame let out a shaky breath. It was over. At least for now. He slowly turned to his mother. Abeni stood in the middle of the room, her shoulders slumped, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden table. She was crying, but not loudly. Just soft, exhausted sobs, the kind that told Kwame she had no more strength left to fight. He didn't say anything. Instead, he gently lifted Zuri onto his back, carrying her to their small mattress in the corner of the room. She was already half asleep, her little body exhausted from fear. "It's okay, Zuri," he whispered, tucking her under a thin blanket. "Go to sleep now." Zuri murmured something, too quiet to hear, before her breathing slowed into sleep. Kwame sat beside her, staring at the ceiling, his heart still racing. He closed his eyes and, for the 100th time, whispered a prayer. "Dear God, please help us. Please make Mama and Baba stop fighting. I just want us to be happy." But deep inside, he wondered if anyone was really listening. The only sound left in the night was the distant hoot of an owl and the steady, sorrowful beat of Kwame's heart. The morning sun peeked through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting golden rays across the small hut. The village outside had already come to life, women balancing baskets on their heads as they made their way to the market, men gathering at the well, and children laughing as they chased each other barefoot through the dusty paths. But inside Kwame's home, the air was heavy. The weight of last night's fight still lingered like smoke after a fire. Kwame woke up before anyone else, as he always did. He turned to check on Zuri, who was still curled up under their thin blanket, breathing softly. He wished she could sleep like this forever, safe and unaware of the storm raging between their parents. Slowly, he got up and tiptoed toward the small wooden basin of water. He splashed his face, shaking off the exhaustion that clung to him. Today was just another day of pretending everything was fine. He moved to the small cooking area, grabbing a clay pot to boil some porridge for Zuri. His mother usually prepared their meals, but she wouldn't be up for a while. After the fight last night, she had collapsed onto the wooden bench and cried herself to sleep. Kwame stirred the pot in silence, lost in thought. A few minutes later, Abeni stirred awake. She looked tired, her eyes puffy from crying, her body slumped as if the weight of her world had crushed her spirit. She barely acknowledged Kwame as she sat at the table, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the wooden surface. Then, the door creaked open. Jabari walked in. Kwame tensed. His father looked calm, but Kwame had seen this before. After every fight, Jabari would leave, and by morning, he would return as if nothing had happened. Abeni didn't look at him. Neither of them spoke. The silence was worse than the shouting. Kwame placed a small wooden bowl of porridge in front of Zuri as she rubbed her sleepy eyes. "Eat, Zuri," he said softly. She took the bowl, her tiny hands still trembling. Kwame noticed it, how she hesitated before bringing the spoon to her lips, how she glanced at their parents as if waiting for another explosion. His stomach twisted. He couldn't take it anymore. "Mommy. Daddy." His voice was small, but it cut through the silence like a sharp blade. Both of them looked at him. "I need to talk to you," he said, standing up. His hands were shaking, but he clenched them into fists, willing himself to be brave. Jabari frowned but pulled out a chair. Abeni sighed and did the same. Kwame swallowed hard. He had to say this. "Last night, you fought again," he said, looking at both of them. "Like you always do." Abeni shifted uncomfortably. Jabari crossed his arms. Zuri was crying. "I was scared." "We're always scared," Kwame continued, his voice rising slightly. "I don't know why you keep fighting, but it hurts us." Abeni's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. "I just want us to be happy," Kwame whispered. "I want to come home and not be afraid. I want Zuri to smile again." He took a deep breath. "Can't you stop fighting? Can't you just try to love each other again?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, Jabari exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Kwame, this is not something a child should worry about. You don't understand." "But I do," Kwame said, his voice cracking. "I see everything. Every time you fight, it feels like our home is breaking." Abeni closed her eyes and ran a hand over her face. "Kwame, it's not that simple." "But why not?" Kwame asked desperately. "Why can't you stop?" Jabari stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "See, Abeni. Even the boy is blaming me now. I didn't tell him to say anything." Abeni snapped. "He's just speaking the truth." And just like that, they were arguing again. Kwame felt like something inside him was crumbling. He had tried to speak, to make them understand, but nothing had changed. Zuri whimpered beside him, pressing her hands against her ears. Kwame clenched his fist. He had to get out of here. Without saying another word, he grabbed his school bag, kissed Zuri's forehead, and walked out of the house. His parents' voices followed him, but he didn't look back. The dirt road leading to the village school was warm beneath his bare feet, but Kwame hardly noticed. His mind was too full, too heavy. At school, he sat at his desk, staring at the blackboard as Madam Kessia explained a math problem. Normally, Kwame was one of the brightest students. But today, he couldn't focus. The numbers blurred together, meaningless against the storm in his head. "Kwame." He blinked. His best friend, turned, was watching him from the desk behind him. "Are you okay?" Kwame forced a small nod. "I'm fine." But he wasn't. And Madame Kessia knew it. After class, she knelt beside his desk, her voice gentle. "You're very quiet today, Kwame. Is something wrong?" Kwame hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything, but what would she do? Nothing would change. Nothing ever did. So he forced a smile. "I'm okay, Mom." Madame Kessia studied him for a moment, but she didn't press. "All right," she said softly. "But if you ever need to talk, I'm here." Kwame nodded, but inside, his heart ached. He was tired of talking. Tired of hoping. As he packed his bag to go home, he made a decision. He wasn't going back. Not yet. Instead, he would go to Aunt Naima. Because if his parents wouldn't listen, maybe she would. Kwame walked quickly through the village, his small feet kicking up dust as he headed toward Aunt Naima's house. He knew he couldn't stay away from home forever, but right now, he needed to be somewhere safe, somewhere that didn't feel like it was falling apart. Aunt Naima's house was a small mud brick hut near the river, surrounded by mango trees. Unlike his own home, it was always filled with warmth. She lived alone, but her door was always open to anyone in need. When Kwame reached the doorstep, he hesitated. Would she even understand? Would she think he was just a child who didn't know anything? Taking a deep breath, he knocked. The door creaked open, and Aunt Naima, a woman with kind eyes and deep lines of wisdom on her face, looked down at him. Her expression immediately changed from surprise to concern. "Kwame, what are you doing here, child?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. Kwame stepped into the familiar warmth of her home. The scent of roasted maize filled the air, and a small clay lamp flickered in the corner. Aunt Naima placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Where is Zoe? Is everything all right?" Kwame swallowed hard. He had promised himself he wouldn't cry. But the weight of his heart was too much to bear. "No, Auntie," he whispered. "Everything is not all right." She led him to a woven mat on the floor and sat beside him. "Tell me, my son." Kwame took a deep breath. "Mommy and Daddy are always fighting," he began, his voice shaky. "They shout at each other all the time. They throw things. They don't listen. They don't care that Zoe is scared, that I'm scared." He looked down at his hands, his small fingers twisting together. "I try to stop them, but they never listen to me. I don't know what to do anymore." Aunt Naima's face softened, her eyes filling with sadness. She reached out and gently wiped away a tear that had escaped down his cheek. "Oh, my child," she murmured, pulling him into a warm embrace. "I am so sorry you and Zoe have to go through this." Kwame buried his face in her shoulder. "I just want them to stop," he whispered. Aunt Naima pulled back and looked at him seriously. "You are a brave boy, Kwame. Speaking about this takes courage." Kwame sniffed and nodded. "Can you talk to Mommy? Maybe she will listen to you." Aunt Naima hesitated for a moment. Then, she nodded. "Yes. I will talk to her. But, Kwame, I need you to understand something." She gently cupped his face in her hands. "Their fights are not your fault. It is not your job to fix them. You are just a child. You should not have to carry this burden." Kwame wanted to believe her, but deep inside, he still felt responsible. Aunt Naima sighed and stood up. "Let's go. I will take you home and speak to your mother." Kwame didn't want to go back, but at least he wouldn't be alone this time. When they arrived at Kwame's home, the door was slightly open. Abeni was sitting on a wooden stool, her head resting in her hands. She looked up as they entered, her eyes tired and swollen. "Naima?" she asked, surprised. Then, her gaze fell on Kwame. "Where have you been?" Aunt Naima didn't waste time. "Abeni, we need to talk." Abeni sighed but nodded, motioning for them to sit. Kwame sat quietly as his aunt spoke. Abeni, I know things between you and Jabari have been difficult, Aunt Naima began carefully. But your children are suffering. Kwame came to me today, crying, because he cannot take it anymore. Abeni flinched. He told you that? Kwame lowered his gaze. He didn't want to hurt his mother, but he needed her to understand. Aunt Naima continued, her voice firm but kind. I know you love your children, but love is not enough if they are living in fear. If this marriage is harming them, you need to make a choice. You need to think of what's best for them. Abeni stared at the floor. I don't know what to do, Naima. I have nowhere to go. If I leave Jabari, how will I take care of my children? Kwame's chest tightened. Mommy, we don't need a big house or fancy things. We just need peace. Abeni covered her mouth, her shoulders trembling. For a moment, Kwame thought she understood. That maybe, just maybe, things would change. Then, the door swung open with force. Jabari stepped inside, his face dark with suspicion. What is this? He demanded, looking between Abeni and Naima. Are you telling my wife to leave me? Aunt Naima stood up. I am telling her to put her children first, Jabari. Jabari scoffed. This is none of your business. It became my business when Kwame came to my house, begging for help, she shot back. Jabari's eyes flickered toward Kwame. You went to her? Kwame didn't look away. Yes. Jabari let out a bitter laugh. You think your aunt can fix this? You think running away will change anything? Aunt Naima stepped between them. Jabari, listen to yourself. Your own son is afraid of you. Is this the man you want to be? Jabari's jaw clenched. He looked at Abeni, waiting for her to defend him. But Abeni stayed silent. Jabari shook his head. I don't need advice from you, Naima. This is my family. Aunt Naima sighed. She had tried, but she knew when words wouldn't be enough. She turned to Abeni one last time. You have a choice, Abeni. If you stay in this, it is your decision. But know that you are also choosing this life for your children. Abeni's lips trembled. She didn't answer. Jabari crossed his arms. That's what I thought. Kwame's heart sank. Nothing had changed. His mother still wouldn't leave. His father still wouldn't listen. Aunt Naima turned to Kwame and placed a hand on his shoulder. You are always welcome at my home, she said softly. I will always be here for you. Kwame swallowed hard and nodded. Aunt Naima left. Jabari went outside, mumbling angrily to himself. Abeni stayed at the table, unmoving. And Kwame. He sat down beside Zuri, brushing her tiny curls away from her face as she played with a piece of cloth. He had tried. He had really tried. But now, he didn't know what else to do. And for the first time in his life, he started to wonder. Maybe things would never change. Days turned into weeks, but nothing changed. The fights continued. The shouting grew louder. The home that once felt like a place of love now felt like a battlefield where Kwame and Zuri were just innocent bystanders, watching, waiting, hoping for peace that never came. One evening, the tension in the air was thicker than usual. Jabari had come home later than expected, his footsteps heavy as he entered the house. Abeni, who had been waiting, immediately rose from her seat. Her eyes flashed with suspicion. Where were you? She asked. Jabari barely looked at her as he set his bag down. I was working. Abeni scoffed. At this hour. Kwame's stomach tightened. He had seen this argument play out too many times. He looked down at Zuri, who was already clinging to his arm, sensing the storm before it even hit. Not tonight, Kwame whispered under his breath. Please, not tonight. But his silent prayer went unheard. Abeni stepped forward, holding a crumpled piece of paper in her hand. Then explain this. She shoved the paper toward Jabari's chest. He frowned, snatching it from her hands. It was a receipt from an expensive restaurant in the nearby town. Jabari's face darkened. Are you going through my things now? Abeni folded her arms. So, while your children barely have enough to eat, you are out spending money on fancy meals. Tell me, Jabari, who were you with? Jabari clenched his jaw. I don't have to explain myself to you. And just like that, the fire erupted. You think I don't know what you're doing? Abeni shouted. You think I'm blind? You leave this house, disappear for hours, and come home with lies. You are a disgrace of a husband. Jabari's nostrils flared. And you? You are nothing but a woman who loves to complain. No matter what I do, it is never enough for you. Objects started flying. Abeni grabbed the clay cup and hurled it against the wall, shattering it into 100 pieces. Zuri screamed. Kwame quickly pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as their parents' voices clashed like thunder. You are ruining this family, Jabari. No, you are the one who destroys everything, Abeni. Kwame couldn't take it anymore. Stop it, he screamed. For a moment, the house fell into silence. Jabari and Abeni both turned to look at him. Kwame's whole body was shaking. He was breathing hard, his hands clenched into fists. Can't you see what you're doing? He cried. Zuri is scared. I am scared. Every single day, I wake up hoping that maybe today will be different, but it never is. I begged you to stop. I begged you to think about us. But you don't listen. You never listen. Abeni's lips parted, but she had no words. Jabari exhaled, rubbing his forehead in frustration. Kwame, this is... No, Baba, Kwame cut him off. This is your fault. Both of you. We are just children. We should not have to live like this. His voice cracked. His heart ached. But he was done. Completely done. Abeni's eyes filled with tears. Kwame. But before she could finish, Jabari turned away, shaking his head. I don't have time for this. He grabbed his coat and stormed toward the door. Jabari. Abeni called after him. But he didn't stop. He left. The door slammed shut behind him, rattling the entire house. Abeni stood frozen in place, her hands trembling. Kwame bit his lip, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. He wanted to cry. He wanted to scream. Instead, he turned and walked towards the small mattress in the corner. He sat down beside her, gently stroking her hair as she whimpered softly into his chest. Don't be scared, Zuri, he whispered. I'm here. Zuri sniffled and held onto him tightly, her little fingers digging into his arm. Across the room, Abeni sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. For the first time in years, Kwame saw something different in his mother's posture. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was tired. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally starting to understand. The house was eerily silent the next morning. No shouting. No accusations. Just an empty quietness that felt heavier than any argument ever had. Kwame sat on the floor, helping Zuri tie the loose strings of her small sandals. Her big brown eyes were still clouded with sleep, but at least today, she wasn't crying. Across the room, Abeni sat by the table, staring into nothingness. She had barely spoken since Jabari stormed out last night. Kwame wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. He wasn't even sure how he felt anymore. A part of him had always hoped things would get better, that if he just tried hard enough, begged enough, prayed enough, his parents would change. But now, he was starting to think that no matter what he did, this house would never be whole again. A loud knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Abeni flinched but didn't move. Kwame sighed and stood up, carefully stepping over Zuri before opening the door. It was Aunt Naima. Her face was stern, her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't even greet him before stepping inside. "Where is your mother?" she asked. Kwame pointed toward the table. Aunt Naima marched over, pulling a stool beside Abeni. "We need to talk." Abeni blinked slowly. "I don't have the strength for this today, Naima." "Well, you better find it," Aunt Naima replied. "Because I won't stay silent while my nephew and niece suffer in this house." Kwame held Zuri's hand as they washed. He wanted to believe Aunt Naima could make a difference, but deep down, he was afraid. Would this conversation change anything? Or would things just go back to the way they always were? Later that evening, Jabari returned home. Kwame knew the second he stepped through the door that something was different. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. Instead, his face was blank, too blank. Abeni immediately stood up. "Where have you been?" Jabari didn't answer. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a cup of water, and drank it in slow, heavy gulps. Something inside Kwame told him to grab Zuri and leave the room. But before he could move, Abeni slammed her hands against the table. "I asked you a question, Jabari." Jabari finally turned to look at her. "Why do you care?" Abeni let out a bitter laugh. "You disappear all night, then come back like nothing happened. Like you don't have a family waiting for you." "I didn't ask you to wait for me," Jabari muttered. Abeni clenched her fist. "You are my husband. You are supposed to." "I am supposed to what, Abeni?" Jabari snapped. "Supposed to listen to you complain every single day. Supposed to come home and be treated like a failure. I am tired of this." Kwame's breath hitched. The storm was building again. "You are tired," Abeni shrieked. "What about me? I have carried this marriage, raised these children, held everything together while you held everything together." Jabari interrupted, his voice dangerously low. "The only thing you have done is make this house miserable." Abeni's face twisted with hurt. But before she could speak, Jabari took a step forward. "You always blame me, Abeni. Always." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "But maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe it's you." Abeni's whole body tensed. "What did you just say?" Kwame felt his stomach drop. Jabari's voice was colder than he had ever heard it. "I said," Jabari whispered, "maybe you are the reason this family is falling apart." Silence. A heavy, painful silence. Then, crash. Abeni grabbed a clay plate from the table and hurled it at the wall, where it shattered into sharp pieces. Zuri screamed and hid behind Kwame. Kwame's hands were shaking. It was happening again. And this time, it was worse. Jabari's face turned red with rage. "You crazy woman," he shouted. "I should have never married you." Abeni stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "Then leave, Jabari. Leave." And then, Jabari raised his hand. It was the first time. The very first time. He had never hit her before. But tonight was different. Everything was different. Kwame's heart stopped. Abeni gasped, stumbling back as Jabari's slap echoed through the small room. For a moment, nobody moved. Even Jabari looked shocked at what he had done. Abeni slowly raised her hand to her cheek, her breathing uneven. Zuri was sobbing into Kwame's shirt, shaking like a leaf in the wind. Kwame felt rage bubbling inside him, hot, suffocating rage. He had begged them to stop. And now, it had come to this. He couldn't stay here. Not anymore. He grabbed Zoe's hand and ran to the door. Kwame, wait. Abeni called. But he didn't stop. He threw open the door and ran into the night, Zoe stumbling behind him. He didn't care where he was going. He just knew that he had to get away. Kwame didn't stop running until he reached their neighbor's house. He banged on the wooden door, his small fist trembling. The door opened, and Mama Eo, an elderly woman from their village, looked down at him with wide eyes. Kwame. What's wrong? Kwame was gasping for breath, tears streaming down his face. Please, he whispered, his voice breaking. Please help us. Mama Eo's expression darkened with concern. She pulled them inside and shut the door. Kwame collapsed onto the floor, clutching Zoe tightly as she sobbed into his chest. For the first time in his life, he truly understood. His home was not a home anymore. It was a place of pain. And no matter how much he had prayed, how much he had hoped, things were never going to change. Kwame sat on the floor of Mama Eo's house, his arms wrapped tightly around Zoe, who had cried herself to sleep against his chest. His heart still pounded from the fear and chaos he had left behind, and his mind raced with everything that had happened. The slap. His mother's gasp. His father's rage. And now, he was here. Mama Eo knelt beside him, placing a warm hand on his shoulder. You are safe now, child, she whispered. But was he? Would he ever be safe? The next morning, the first thing Kwame saw was Aunt Naima's worried face as she stepped into Mama Eo's home. Kwame, she said, kneeling in front of him, her voice thick with emotion. Are you all right? Kwame wanted to say yes. Wanted to tell her he was fine. But the truth was, he wasn't. He shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. Without hesitation, Aunt Naima pulled him and Zoe into a tight embrace. I'm so sorry, my children, she whispered. You never should have had to go through this. For the first time in a long time, Kwame let himself cry. Not silent tears. Not quiet sobs hidden in the darkness of the night. But real, broken, uncontrollable sobs. Aunt Naima held him as he cried, her hand gently stroking Zoe's hair. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Kwame felt like someone truly understood. Later that day, Aunt Naima took Kwame and Zoe back home. But when they arrived, the house felt different. It wasn't just the broken plates still on the floor or the silence that hung in the air. It was something deeper. Jabari wasn't there. Abeni sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale, her hands trembling. The moment she saw Kwame and Zoe, fresh tears welled in her eyes. My babies, she whispered, running forward to pull them close. Zoe clung to her, but Kwame stood still. Because something was still wrong. Where is Baba? He asked. Abeni's lips trembled. He's gone. Kwame's eyes widened. Gone where? Abeni let out a shaky breath. After last night, he left. He said he was done. Kwame blinked. Jabari was gone. The man who had loomed over his childhood like a storm, the man who had made their home a battlefield, was gone. Just like that. No apology. No goodbye. Just gone. Abeni let out a choked sob, covering her face with her hands. I should have left first, she whispered. I should have taken you both away before things got this bad. Kwame felt nothing. No sadness. No relief. Just emptiness. Wasn't this what he had wanted? For the fighting to stop. For things to change. Then why did it feel so wrong? The next few weeks were quiet. Too quiet. Jabari never returned, and Abeni was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered home. She stopped arguing, stopped yelling, stopped everything. She spent most days in silence, lost in thought, while Kwame took care of Zuri. But even without the fighting, things didn't feel whole. One evening, as Kwame helped Zuri wash her face by the small water basin, Abeni finally spoke. "Kwame," she said softly. He turned. She was watching him, her eyes full of pain and something else. "Regret. I am sorry," she whispered. "For everything." Kwame stared at her, unsure what to say. "I should have listened," she continued, her voice breaking. "I should have left long ago. I thought I was staying for you and Zuri, but I see now that I was only making things worse." Kwame swallowed hard. "I can't change the past," Abeni said. "But I promise you, my son, I will never let you live in fear again." For the first time in his life, Kwame saw his mother not as a victim, but as a survivor. And maybe, just maybe, they could still heal. Together, Aunt Naima started visiting more often, helping Abeni rebuild the home. Mama Eo made sure Zuri always had warm food. And slowly, painfully, the wounds began to heal. Kwame still had nightmares. Still flinched at loud noises. But one day, as he walked to school, something strange happened. He smiled. It was small. Barely there. But it was real. Because for the first time in a long time, the storm was over. And he was still standing years past. The wounds never fully disappeared, but they no longer controlled Kwame. He was no longer the scared little boy who hid in the shadows of his parents' fights. He was something more. Something stronger. At 18 years old, Kwame stood in the village square, speaking in front of a group of young children. His voice was calm, steady, full of purpose. "Once, there was a boy who lived in a house full of storms," he said. "A boy who prayed every night for peace, but it never came." The children listened, wide-eyed, as Kwame continued. "But the boy learned something important," he said. "He learned that storms don't last forever. That no matter how dark things seem, there is always a way forward." One of the little boys raised his hand. "What happened to the boy?" Kwame smiled. "He grew up," he said simply. And he promised himself that he would never let another child feel the way he once did. The children clapped, and Kwame's heart swelled. He had found his purpose. He couldn't change what happened to him. But he could use it. Use his pain to help others. To remind children like him that they were not alone. After the talk, Zuri, now 11 years old, ran up to him, beaming. "You're getting really good at this," she said. Kwame ruffled her hair. "You think so?" She nodded. "Yes. The kids love your stories." A warm chuckle came from behind them. Aunt Naima. She was older now, but her eyes were still as kind as ever. "You have a gift, Kwame," she said. "Your words can change lives." Kwame smiled. "Maybe." He turned back toward the village. The place that had once been nothing but pain now felt different. Brighter. Stronger. His mother, Abeni, had rebuilt her life. She had started selling handmade baskets in the marketplace and was no longer the broken woman she once was. And Jabari. He never returned. Kwame had spent years wondering if his father would ever come back. But now, he realized, it didn't matter. He had all the family he needed. The family who had stayed. The family who had fought for him. And as the sun began to set over Mbale, Kwame took a deep breath, feeling something he had not felt in years. Peace. Not because his past had disappeared, but because he had finally learned how to live beyond it. And for the first time in his life, he knew. The storm within him had finally passed.